Good morning. So we're in this sermon series on mental health and the gospel, and today we're talking about burnout. Now, this is a bit different from other messages we've done so far, for example, the one on depression or on anxiety, in that burnout is not universally recognized as a medical condition. Or at least there isn't solid consensus that burnout is anything other than everyday stress taken to the extreme. And a lot of people in the mental health community do believe that it is theoretically possible that we experience something like adrenal fatigue, where stress every single day, the constant, ups and downs of life just wear on us over time. That's quite possible. The trouble is that you can't measure that. It doesn't show up in brain scans. It doesn't show up in blood tests. But burnout is real. Now, it hasn't been listed in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and so at this point it's kind of hard to classify, but man, if you're living it, it's very real. It's part of our cultural vocabulary, isn't it? Affects a huge proportion of the population. And I know I don't really need to throw statistics at you, because chances are you know someone who has gone through burnout. Or maybe you're somewhere on that slope yourself. Now, like a lot of mental health issues, burnout is a profoundly spiritual experience. It affects our sense of who God is, what God is like. It affects our sense of our relationship with God and whether or not we're okay. I want to read with you one woman's story. This is one picture of what burnout can look like, and maybe it'll resonate with you a little bit. Her name is Shauna Murray. She writes, "In 2003, I found myself falling off a steep emotional cliff into a sea, an ocean of darkness and depression and despair. I had gone from a strong, multitasking, homeschooling mom, a pastor's wife, and working part-time as a doctor to a broken shell. A major crash, no joy left, just sadness and despair." Well, the question arises, well, how did this happen? And to give you a little bit of the background, I'd been a Christian since I was very young. I don't know the exact date. I struggled a lot with assurance in my younger years, my teen years, but I'd gotten a kind of established state where I felt more of the joy of the Lord. I had assurance. I wanted to spend it in the Lord's service. I was very conscientious. My personality was also very determined, very focused. I'd gone to med school, I focused on studies, routine, discipline, and all I had to worry about was myself. So I could work really hard, but I could relax too, because I have no other responsibilities. But things were building up in my life. And the other thing that was very significant was that I wasn't someone who would ask for help. I always had this view like, everyone's busy and I don't want to bother other people. I also had unrealistic expectations of myself, way beyond what God has and did have. I thought I was responsible for everyone and everything that came into my radar. Not just partially, but 100%. If you're needy and you need help, I can help. And it was ultimate total responsibility for areas and things that I had that God never expected me to have. I lived beside aging parents. I felt responsible for them. 2 marriages of people very close to me in my life broke up, and they were Christians, and that was devastating to me, I'd never expected that, and, how does that happen to Christians? At the same time, there was a lot of bad news in the world. The war on terror had begun, 2001. I remember watching Teletubbies with my little boys, and the World Trade Center came crashing down. And at this particular time, I was swirling in a sea of pregnancy hormones. I was 4 months pregnant with my 4th child, and over a 4-month period, I began to go through an emotional decline, where I became very sad and very tearful, beginning to feel isolated and detached, even from people who loved me, like my husband and my kids. I was like an island, like a cork bobbing in the ocean. God began to feel very far away. Physically, I began to feel weak. I lost my appetite. I started losing weight. I started getting lots of feelings of fear and terror, like a sense of a weight sitting on my chest. Panic, anxiety, inexplicable fear. I did not know where it came from. I knew I wasn't dying of anything because I understood panic attacks, but I hadn't really understood it. This is living terror. And the terror became very kind of almost spiritual conceptually. And when I'd be reading the Bible, it seemed worse. I began imperceptibly to think that God was against me. God was my enemy. I became terrified of God. He felt far away. I wondered, was I ever converted? This is one woman's experience of burnout. So how would you know if you're on the slope towards this? How would you know if someone around you, someone you know, someone you love, someone you cared about, was headed towards this? What could you do about it? Well, let's talk about some definitions of symptoms. As I said before, this isn't classified as a mental illness per se, so there isn't one accepted definition. There's not one accepted standard by which you can evaluate someone and say, okay, you are in burnout. A starting place might be the definition offered by the World Health Organization, which defines burnout as strictly unmanaged workplace stress, marked by feelings of energy depletion or exhaustion, increased mental distance from one's job, or feelings of negativism or cynicism related to one's job, reduced professional efficacy, and that's it. The problem with this definition is that burnout isn't just something that happens in the workplace, is it? It's not just something that happens while you're on the clock, while you're on the job. It affects our homes, it affects our churches, it affects our families too. Let me read to you one other definition I found in Psychology Today. This is Dr. Suzanne Degis. I can't say her name. It doesn't matter. She says, when burnout is on the horizon, you're likely going to experience its three main symptoms. First, exhaustion. Addressing the physical aspects of this state, Ayala Pines and Elliott and Art, so many names, define burnout as a state of physical, emotional, and mental exhaustion caused by long-term involvement in emotionally demanding situations. Second, disillusionment. Herbert J. Freudenberger focused on the psychological and emotional impact that burnout has on an individual. He defined it as a state of fatigue or frustration brought about by devotion to a cause, a way of life, or a relationship that failed to produce the expected reward. Third, this one's interesting, erosion of the soul. She says, not only does burnout take a toll on the physical body and emotional well-being, it eats away at what Maslow and later considered the soul. They affirmed that burnout is defined as the index of the dislocation between what people are and what they have to do. It represents an erosion of values, dignity, spirit, and will, an erosion of the human soul. It's a malady that spreads gradually and continues over time, putting people in a downward spiral. Now, as believers, we know that the soul is real. We know that we are not just machines that stall when we're overworked. We're not just robots that wear out over time. We are this beautiful unity of body and mind and spirit. We're created by God for relationship with Him. We're created for relationship with each other. And when our lives diverge from the way God made us to live, we hit the wall. Our whole being, body, mind, and spirit, just says, that's it, no more. You can't continue this way. And then things fall apart, and you know what? People get hurt. There is always collateral damage with burnout because we lose our capacity for compassion. So how do we keep ourselves from hitting that wall? Well, first of all, we need to understand the risk factors. We need to understand the factors that contribute to this situation, but we also need to know that there are resources in the gospel to help us from getting to this place. So the first place I want us to look is what I'm going to call the crisis of capacity. This one's pretty simple. It's pretty intuitive. It's the fact that sometimes we are in situations that demand more mental and physical and spiritual energy than we have to give. And when we work too hard for too long with unrelenting demands, we might think that we can just keep going. We might feel like we have to keep going, but then our bodies and our minds desert us, don't they? They keep us from being able to perform to what we expect. We put expectations on ourselves that, if I can do this for one day, I should be able to do this indefinitely. I can keep all these plates spinning. Maybe someone else puts that expectation on us, but we can't change the fact that we are human. We have limitations. We have only so many hours to give. We have only so much energy. We can push ourselves to do incredible things in the short term, but there's always a long-term cost. John Ortberg is a pastor down in California. He's also a doctor of clinical psychology. And he notes this. He says, the soul craves rest. Our wills sometimes rejoice in striving. Our bodies were made to at least sometimes know the exhilaration of a tremendous challenge. Our minds get stretched when they must focus, even when tired. But the soul craves rest. The soul knows only borrowed strength. The soul was made to rest in God the way that a tree rests in soil. One of the challenges of soul fatigue is that it does not have the same obvious signs as physical fatigue. If you've run a marathon, your body lets you know it's finished. Our souls were not made to run on empty. But the soul doesn't come with a gauge. The indicators of soul fatigue are more subtle. First, things seem to bother you more than they should. Second, it's hard to make up your mind about even simple decisions. Third, impulses to eat or drink or spend or crave will be harder to resist than they otherwise would. You also are more likely to favor short-term gains in ways that will leave you with long-term costs. Your judgment suffers and you have less courage. So what do we do with this? What do we do when we're faced with these demands on us that exceed our capacity to meet them? One of the 10 Commandments we talked about last year is to remember the Sabbath and to keep it holy. Keep it set apart. Don't do any work. Don't demand any work from anyone else. What a radical concept, right? Now, this side of the cross, we live under a new covenant. Our righteousness before God is not established or maintained by obedience to the law, but that does not mean that the Sabbath is irrelevant as a concept. Jesus didn't see it as irrelevant. Jesus objected very strongly to the legalistic ways that people thought of and practiced the Sabbath. But Jesus knew that the Sabbath is actually something good. In Mark 2:27, he said the Sabbath was made to meet the needs of people and not people to meet the requirements of Sabbath. See, sometimes we forget that we are human beings, but God does not forget that we are human beings. He knows that we were not made to face the relentless onslaught of tasks and responsibilities without stopping, without resting. We need to understand our need to rest, that limitation is not actually a weakness. It is not a deficiency in how we're made. This is actually part of what it means to be made in the image of God. I don't know if you realize that. Now, if you look at ancient Near Eastern religions, one of the things you notice is that human beings in ancient Near Eastern religions exist for a very different purpose, right? So the gods in those religions, they have needs. They need food, they need entertainment, they need temples to live in. It's people's job to work for them and provide for their needs. But the Lord, the God of the Bible, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, he has no needs. He does not need us to do anything for him. He created us for relationship with him. He created us to enjoy him and enjoy all he made. He gave us the Sabbath so that we could stop, so that we could enjoy our own existence, enjoy our relationship with him, focus on him. He worked 6 days to create the world, rested on the seventh. He didn't rest because he had some deficiency. He did it because that time to enjoy himself was worth it. Rest is part of what it means to be truly human. So the Old Testament gives us this pattern. You work 6 days, then you rest. Maybe you're thinking, that is a nice aspirational goal. One day I will retire. One day I will reach the financial threshold where I am able to meet the standard of living to which I have become accustomed, and then that day will come that I will take a day off. Let me push back on that a little bit. Okay? Let me ask you a rhetorical question. That means you do not need to answer. Can you work 24 hours a day? Yes. Should you? No. Why not? Because you're going to pay the price the next day and probably the day after if you do that. You're also going to hit the wall of fatigue where, if you work 24 hours, you're probably not doing your best work in the last 12. Probably not that effective at your job. You recognize that in order to sustain yourself, in order to experience success over the long run, doesn't matter how pressing the need is, you just don't do it, right? We recognize that we need boundaries, we need limitations as human beings in order to survive, in order to do a good job, and in order to thrive. Yes, we all know that. If you don't, you're probably manic. And that's a serious other problem. Now, when we're talking about Sabbath, we are talking about recognizing that if we do not have regular awake time of rest, time to focus on God, time to enjoy his creation, we are trading our long-term sustainability, our long-term flourishing for just short-term gains. We are headed toward burnout. When we refuse this gift of Sabbath that God created for our own good, we rob ourselves of life and joy and peace and strength. So, if your life is sliding toward burnout, maybe it's time to start taking Sabbath seriously. Second crisis that is a risk factor for burnout is a crisis of community. So one of the reasons why capacity is an issue is because we feel that we have to shoulder all of life's burdens on our own. Or maybe we feel like we are alone and that's not by our own choice. It could be very well that you are in a situation where your employer or your business shoulders you with 100% of the responsibilities, and there's never a time that you can feel like you can be unplugged. There's never a time that you can mentally and emotionally leave it behind and check out. It's just always there. No one understands, and there's no one to talk to about it because you just don't have time for friends. This is part of the reason why burnout is a workplace issue, but it's not just a workplace issue. It's also something that people who are caregivers for their families will face as well. Burnout is something that happens when that responsibility for caring for someone falls on one person's shoulders. It could be elderly parents. It could be someone who is sick or disabled. It could be even having kids. The pressure can be relentless. And sometimes it can be just too much to bear. It's hard to be the only one who can do what needs doing, and it's also harder when there's no one to talk to about it, when you feel isolated and alone in it. You know what, brothers and sisters? We are not meant to live this way. We are created for community, and that means we have this gift of brothers and sisters, people around us to support one another. You know, Jesus had community. Jesus had friends. His disciples were not just his students. His disciples were not just there to learn and to be his followers. They were also his friends. And in his distress, in his agony, he was happy to have them there with him in it. On the night he was betrayed, he wanted his friends to be there to support him. That's not a weakness. That's not a deficiency. Now, in most cultures, your blood relatives are the go-to people. They are the front line of care. With the gospel, we get a radical redefinition of what a blood relative is, don't we? Your family is not just the people who are genetically near to you. Your family is bigger than you realize. It's the church. From the earliest days of the New Testament, as we read the book of Acts, we see that caring for one another, being together, this is what the church does. The church is extremely practically focused on one another's needs. It's a place where widows and orphans come to have the family support that their society never gave them. People didn't have to struggle alone. There were people there to listen when they were struggling and help and pray with them. Now, what does that mean for us as a church? Listen, I am so thankful for all the aspects of fellowship that happen in this church. I'm thankful that, after the service, people hang around for a long time to talk to one another and catch up. But let's be honest here. Sunday morning is way short of the kind of community that we are called to as the family of Christ. Singing next to each other, listening to someone like me talk for 40 minutes, chatting for 10 minutes after the service, that is not the full version of what it means to be a church. For the church to be the church, we have to live the way that God made us to live as a family, as brothers and sisters. And that's more than Sunday mornings, guys. Home groups are a really great place for us to start. Home groups provide that time that we can actually have a dialogue. We can eat together. We can pray together. If you are needing someone to just vent at and say, I understand, that is a service we are happy to provide. And we can help each other out too. We as a church, we're not complete. We're not doing our job unless we are doing those kinds of things. But as human beings, we are headed for burnout, and we are not complete unless we are willing to let people into our lives. We are willing to share about our struggles with someone, have someone pray with us, ask someone to help when we need it. We need community. The third risk factor is a crisis of criticism. Now, when people are burned out, some of the words they use to describe what they're experiencing are words like numb, or jaded, or demotivated. Do you know why that is? It's because they cared very deeply about something. They cared very deeply about their work, but they were told that their very best was not good enough. And so, as that emotional scar tissue forms on that wound, they just lose that ability to care anymore. I would even say that the more that you care about what it is you're doing, the more you believe in what you're doing, the harder it is to take criticism without that scar tissue forming when someone offers it. You are far more likely to burn out as a result of criticism, because when you care, your work becomes a part of who you are. It becomes a part of your identity. And if people don't appreciate your work, what they are saying is that your 100% was not good enough, and so you yourself are not good enough. It happens in the workplace, and people quit, and they go work somewhere else. It also happens in churches too, whether it be volunteers or staff. This kind of thing happens all the time. They can't handle criticism because they care too much. You know, it used to really astound me that people could go to their jobs from Monday to Friday where their bosses and their customers, they rag on them nonstop, criticize them in every way conceivable, and yet at the end of the day, they can go home, they can go on with life and enjoy the weekend, enjoy their vacation. And it doesn't really get to them all that much because their job is actually not really who they are, right? It doesn't really cut them down to the level of their soul to be told that you messed up, do this differently, do this better. Because it's not their identity. But then they go to church and they serve. And someone tells them that they need to do something differently, or criticizes them in some way, or corrects them in some way. And it really hurts them, like on a very deep level. And they back away. They stop serving. I used to always really wonder why that happened. And it occurred to me, they don't just suddenly become thin-skinned on Sunday morning, right? It's this relationship between caring and being corrected that is different. That's the difference between Monday to Friday and Sunday. If you care, it's hard to be criticized. And if in a church, you're not working for your bosses, you're not working for your wage. Who are you working for? You're working for God. So when you criticize someone, you are criticizing their worship. It's hard to cut someone deeper than that, and that phrase, erosion of the soul, seems really appropriate here. So, what do we do with this? What do we do with this vulnerability that we have when we actually care about stuff? Because I don't think the answer is for us to just not care, right? Should we always be kind to one another? Should we be constructive and affirming in our criticism? Of course, and I think we all know that. I think we recognize that intuitively. 1 Peter 4:8 tells us that we need to love each other deeply because love covers a multitude of sins. Basically means when someone messes up, we allow our love for that person to condition every interaction we have with them, including correction, right? But what do we do when we're on the receiving end? The resources to protect ourselves from becoming cynical when we're corrected, the resources to keep us going when we've been told to do better, that doesn't come from changing how other people treat us. We can't change what other people do. It has to be something that goes on in our own heart. It has to be something where the gospel really takes hold. We have to understand our value in the eyes of God is not built on what we do for him. It's not based on our competence. It's not based on our skills. It's not even based on our reliability to get the job done. It's something else. Look with me at Genesis chapter 4, if you have your Bible. It's a really interesting story. This is post-Garden of Eden, right? This is humanity, the next generation. Genesis 4 says, "Now Adam had sexual relations with his wife Eve, and she became pregnant. And she gave birth to Cain. She said, 'With the Lord's help I have produced a man.' Later, she gave birth to his brother and named him Abel. When they grew up, Abel became a shepherd while Cain cultivated the ground. When it was time for the harvest, Cain presented some of his crops as a gift to the Lord. Abel also brought a gift, the best portions of the firstborn lambs of the flock." So here we have this situation. We have two brothers, and without any apparent direction from the Lord, Cain takes initiative to worship. He takes the initiative to do a good thing, and his brother follows suit and kind of one-ups him a little bit, right? Now, what do these guys know about who God is or what he expects? They know very little. The Bible at this point is like 3 chapters of Genesis. Not literally, but yes, you get the picture. They didn't know, right? Honest mistake. Listen to what Genesis 4 says next. "The Lord accepted Abel and his gift, but he did not accept Cain and his gift. This made Cain very angry, and he looked dejected." Now, I think all of us, if we're honest, we can identify with what Cain is feeling in this moment, right? Someone else did good, you messed up. You brought what you thought was good enough, put yourself into it, but it's not good enough. You ever felt like that? So we need to hear what the Lord says next to Cain. "Why are you so angry?" the Lord asked Cain. "Why do you look so dejected? You will be accepted if you do what's right. But if you refuse to do what is right, then watch out. Sin is crouching at the door, eager to control you. But you must subdue it and be its master." Now, Cain does not watch out. He confuses his own wounded pride with his worth as a human being in the eyes of God. All he knows is that he's been corrected. He lets sin control him. And he does what offended people always do. They hurt other people. See, the only thing that matters to wounded pride is wounded pride. It blinds us to others. It cuts us off from being able to be compassionate. It hardens our hearts towards others. Yes, it demotivates us. It makes us jaded. It makes us numb. And it burns us out. But I can't think of a single time in my life where I felt offended and was able to show compassion towards the people around me at the same time. It just doesn't work. When you are offended, you are focused on yourself. When you are compassionate, you are focused on someone else. You know, we have 2 eyes, but you can't actually look at your navel and your neighbor at the same time. If you do, you need to go to a hospital. The only thing that can protect our hearts from the sting of criticism is for us to know beyond a shadow of a doubt that our worth as human beings is not based on our performance. It's not based on what we do or how we do it. This is what the gospel tells us. This is what we are asked to believe, that before the world was made, I was fully known and I was fully loved. Apart from my ability to perform, apart from the hat that I personally wear as a pastor or whatever other role I have in my life, I am accepted by grace and grace alone. If you know that you are loved, if you know that you are accepted by God, do you know what happens when you're criticized? Well, if it's fair, you say thank you. You learn. You can learn because you know that your worth as a human being is not actually in question. If it's not a fair criticism, you just move on. Because your identity is never really in doubt. You know, I remember back in 2015, my wife and I visited Israel, and we were part of a bit of a kerfuffle on the Temple Mount where we got kicked out because of the actions of someone else. And someone said to me, or called me, an infidel. And I kind of thought, oh, wow, someone actually said that to me. But, you know, it didn't really hurt at all. It didn't cut me to my soul the way that that person really wanted it to, because I just know it's not true. If it's not a fair criticism, it's of no consequence. So there's no reason to obsess over it. Now, the fourth crisis that's a risk factor for burnout is what I'm going to call a crisis of confidence. And this speaks to the disillusionment and the hopelessness that we feel when we see things that we care about fail. It could be one big thing, or it could just be this unrelenting drudgery of one failure after another, however small in life. It could even be how we see things going in the world. But the reality is that life is not playing out the way we envisioned it. It's not this happy narrative of success and good things. It just seems to be this slow decline into misery. And our hearts get broken. And we all lose sometimes. But being able to win once in a while helps, doesn't it? What happens when those wins just don't come? No matter how hard we try, no matter how hard we work, just nothing seems to go right. What happens when our circumstances don't show us any trajectory of improving, right? Well, often we burn out. Without hope, we burn out. I don't know how much you know about the prophet Elijah. Elijah's, in the book of 1st and 2nd Kings, these are books that tend to show up a lot in like children's Bible stories, but then not get talked about once we're grown-ups. But they're amazing stories. And when I was a kid, I loved reading about Elijah because he's famously known for this big showdown he had with the prophets of Baal at a place called Mount Carmel. The backstory of Elijah is that at this time, Israel was being ruled by a evil but also ineffective king named Ahab, who had married this woman named Jezebel, who was a devout follower of Baal, this pagan deity. And she had initiated this state-sponsored program of converting the whole nation to worship Baal And that included paying for priests, paying for prophets and sacrifices and all that kind of stuff, but also systematically seeking out and murdering anyone who followed after the Lord. Genocidal maniac. So Elijah was a man called by God to be a prophet and to turn the nation back to God. At this time, there's a climate change crisis, man-made climate change. And what everyone understood in that context was that the cause for this climate change was that there was trouble in the relationship between heaven and earth. There's a problem in the relationship between God or the gods and man, because we have two different religions competing for the hearts of a people. So, is the problem that people are following the Lord when they should be following Baal, or is the problem that people are following Baal instead of following the Lord? So, in First Kings chapter 18, we read about this contest on Mount Carmel, where they're going to resolve this once and for all, right? So on the one hand, on one side, you have Ahab, you have 850 prophets of this pagan god Baal. And on the other side, you have just Elijah. And they say, okay, here's what we're going to do. We'll set up two altars. We're going to sacrifice a bull on each. And whichever god sends fire to consume the sacrifice, then we will know that that is the true God. That is the living God, and we will worship that God from now on, right? I think everyone envisions this as being like the ideal situation for converting the masses and settling this once and for all. So, I don't know if there's a coin toss or whatever, but Jezebel's prophets go first. And right from the sunrise to sunset, they spend all day singing, dancing, chanting, cutting themselves open, calling out to Baal to come and prove himself and consume this sacrifice, giving many hours for Elijah to mercilessly mock everything that they are doing, because all they're getting is crickets. And the sun goes down, and then it's Elijah's turn, right? So Elijah asks them to douse the whole altar and all the wood and everything with water until everything is absolutely drenched. He just says this little prayer, basically saying, God, please show these people what's up. And as soon as he's finished, fire falls from the sky. Everything is burned. The bull, the wood, the stones, and even the dust. There is nothing but a smoldering crater left. Who is God? Who is the true God? Who should they worship? The people have a very clear and decisive answer. Put this one down as a solid win for Elijah, right? Only it wasn't. Most of the Bible stories I read when I was a kid just kind of end there, and we go, yay! But then if you read the next chapter, you read, no, this wasn't a win. See, the most spectacular sign and wonder you could ever imagine didn't change people's hearts. Nothing changed in Israel. Jezebel was still in charge, and she was more determined than ever to kill Elijah and wipe out this any devotion to Yahweh, whatever it took. So in 1 Kings chapter 19, Elijah is on the run in the wilderness. He's laying under a broom tree, and he is just begging for God to kill him and end his misery. If the greatest barbecue in history couldn't turn the situation around, what else would work? He just didn't see a way for this situation to improve. Things were not going to get better, not for the nation, not for the call God had put on his life, not for him personally. All he could see was failure. He was as burnt out as that bull on the altar. If you know the rest of the Old Testament, you know that Elijah never got another win in his lifetime. He was a broken and a jaded man. But that's not the end of the story, is it? Let me read to you something from the New Testament, Matthew chapter 17. This is almost 900 years after Mount Carmel. Matthew says, Jesus took Peter and the two brothers, James and John, and led them up a high mountain to be alone. As the men watched, Jesus' appearance was transformed so that his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as light. And suddenly, Moses and Elijah appear and begin talking with Jesus. Now, this scene is just loaded with so much prophetic and symbolic significance that there's way more to say about it than I could ever in the limited time I have. But I do want to point out something here. His whole life, Elijah worked and suffered to see the nation turn back to God. That was his life's work. He never saw it happen. Moses, he did lead his people out of slavery in Egypt, but then he had 40 years of wandering in the desert. Never got to set foot in the promised land. Here, in Matthew 17, on this mountain in Judea, along with Peter and John, both Moses and Elijah stood with the one who was there to finish their life's work. They stood in the presence of the one who had not only performed the greatest miracle and the greatest act of liberation the world had ever known, but he would do what Moses and Elijah could never do in their own lifetimes. He was there to turn people's hearts back to God. So whatever setbacks we face in our lives, whatever disappointments we face, listen, God will get the job done. He will do what needs to be done. God's plans for our good, God's plans for humanity, for this world, can never be hijacked. His kingdom will come. His will be done. Life is full of disappointment and failure. That is a certainty for all of us. None of us are going to get through this unscathed by those things, but that is not how the story will end. In every heartbreak, in every failure, in disappointment, in every broken dream, there is always hope. Because the kingdom and the power and the glory always belong to him. No matter what, God wins. And when we wait on the Lord, our strength is renewed. Because by faith we win too. If we're focused on our own successes and failures, if our sense of being okay is hitched to our circumstances, yeah, we're going to burn out because sometimes life is just awful, right? If our focus is not on the wins, but on being faithful, if our focus is on holding on to his promises, we win. Jesus says, be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. The one who conquers will not be hurt by the second death. Let's pray. Lord, you say, come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Lord, I pray for everyone here who is just feeling the weight of the world on their shoulders, feeling the exhaustion that comes from never getting a break, feeling discouraged by the words and criticism of others, or just feeling like nothing is going right. Lord, I pray that you would meet with us. Lord, that we would hold on to the promise of the gospel, that you are good to us. And what you start, you are faithful to complete. Lord, I pray that as a church, you will help us to stand together, to be a family, not just a gathering, but a relationship of care and help for one another, so that none of us have to be alone. Lord, would your Spirit make us strong as we look forward to the day when pain and suffering and death will be no more, and we will be with you forever. Amen.